hidden in plain sight.
Hello, this is episode 3 of season 4 of Hidden in Plain Sight, the program that dares to ask, what if Christopher Marlowe did not die in Deptford in 1593? I'm Dr. Julian, your host, and with me, wearing Christopher Marlowe paraphernalia, is our regular co-host, Carol Paxton. Hey, Carol.
Hello again.
Nice t-shirt.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Carol, as I explained in our previous episodes, you and I are co-hosting a presentation of a pre-recorded conversation between Dr. Joseph Khoury, the professor and chairperson of the Department of English at St. Francis Xavier University at Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and our friend and author of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that inspired our program, Dr. Peter Hodges. Together, they are taking another look at the rival poet sonnets, numbers 78 to 86, in the collection titled Shakespeare's Sonnets, originally published in 1609. Carol and I are providing what you might call a play-by-play commentary on this unique event. But that's enough of us talking. Let's get on with the discussion.
Just to review where we were when we left it off, we'd worked our way through the first 5 identifying statements, and we more or less are agreeing that Chapman is the leading candidate for the role of the rival in the rival poet sonnet.
Yeah, but just to be clear, that's your thesis. I haven't necessarily agreed with any.
Well, we've walked through it, and you haven't come up with an alternative, number one. Although we're postulating there may be one, but of the people that we've studied here, Chapman remains the one who best matches those 5 statements. I want to continue to move along this path of trying to determine whether or not the poem Hero and Leander satisfies the descriptive parts of the rival poet sequence that appear to pertain to a poem. Okay. So the next one is a statement that the fellow makes. He calls this, he speaks of an affable, familiar ghost. Now, this is when in Sonnet 86, when he says, was it his spirit by spirits taught that struck me dead? And he says, no, not he nor any affable familiar ghost is responsible for my silence. And so the question now is affable familiar ghost, is the use of that term something that helps us identify the poem that we're talking about?
Right.
And here we have, when we look at Hero and Leander, we can notice that both Chapman and in the Marlowe version, both of them identify Musaeus as being the person or the originator of the first version, the Greek version of Hero and Leander. So, I'm not saying this is the only instance where a poet or more than one poet makes reference to another poet who is dead as being an inspiration for their poetry. I'm not saying that. Although I will say that I don't believe there's anybody else who specifically refers to Musaeus in Elizabethan literature. I don't think there's anybody else who goes out of his way to pinpoint. There's a lot of people who talk about Ovid, and there's a lot of people who talk about Plutarch, and there's a lot of people who talk about many other poets, Latin poets and Greek poets as being inspirations. and certainly Ovid probably got as much traffic as anyone. But Musaeus is sort of an oddball because he's really only known for this one poem, which is Hero and Leander.
Hmm.
What I'm really trying to get at here is not so much is it Musaeus that we're talking about? Is it, however, that the specific poem Hero and Leander, and in particular the one that includes both Marlowe's original and Chapman's editions, does that one have specific statements made by the two individual authors of a single poet to whom they both refer that you would consider matches the idea of an affable, familiar ghost?
Right.
Now, I think it's almost too easy to say, well, yes, that's obvious because Musaeus inspired both their versions.
Right.
But to take it further, they actually, both of them make statements to that effect. So it's not just that they were in, because, Chapman actually has to do double duty. He has to admit that he's got two people that have inspired him, one of them being Musaeus,
Right.
and the other one being Marlowe.
Marlowe, yeah.
He's writing a continuation. So he's
Right.
therefore speaking of Marlowe, presumably as a spirit. Although I don't think he actually goes quite so far. He does say he's dead, but I don't think he actually, spirit is implied, but I don't think he says that he's a spirit, but he takes inspiration from him. So there's that. But does the poem satisfy that description? That's really all I want. I don't want to have to go, probing too far with this as to who else may have mentioned it. But when we have that affable, familiar ghost mentioned in the sonnet, does Hero and Leander correspond to that statement? And in fairness, I think you have to say it does.
Well, I would go so far as to say the possibility of Chapman being referenced in the sonnets, especially that one, that particular sonnet 86, is certainly a possibility. There's no question. I wouldn't deny that. It is, and again, it's not the first. I mean, it is something that other scholars have speculated about for sure. That
Right.
Chapman may be named in or referenced in this particular sonnet. Yeah.
Right, but you see, I'm trying to take this one step further because when you say Chapman and you stop there, you're kind of freezing the conversation at the man.
Right.
And you're not asking yourself, well, why is Chapman a rival? What is it that Chapman has done that makes him a rival to this other poet, the person who's writing the sonnet? What is that? And it seems if you were talking about poets, it's not because they presented a design for the next great cathedral.
Right.
It's because they've written a poem.
Sure.
And one poet to another, you're my rival because you're writing poetry and I'm writing poetry and we're making a comparison. Where would that comparison come closest to knocking heads, except when you have them both claiming the same poem?
Right.
Now we've got a poem where that affable, familiar ghost is mentioned. And if one is to look at a poem that has something like that in its context, where two rivals could argue over who's better friends with this ghost, Hero and Leander is an example. It's a good example of exactly that.
Sure, but I mean, we do have different kinds of laws. There was no copyright back then, but what was expected back then was the ability to imitate and then emulate, right? So, you were expected to show your learning by imitating, predecessors, especially good ones. There was a kind of expectation, if you will, to show off to try to outdo, other poets. It's sort of, I guess, it's sort of, the example I used when I was teaching recently was slam poetry. My point is that it always involved imitation as well, right? And emulation, that you're supposed to imitate, show off your learning, but then you're supposed to, on top of that, is emulate, right? To try to outdo, to show that you're an even better poet than your opponent,
The only thing I'm trying to say here is
Yeah.
that Hero and Leander fits this category of competitive poetry where one poet can say, that's, that affable familiar ghost, we're both using him as the foundation for our
Okay.
poem. And where do we see a very clear example of that? And that we see in Hero and Leander. Not to say that there aren't any other poems. You see that the thing of this is that it's not going to be one description that does it,
Right.
the accumulation of all of them. It's
Right.
accumulation. So we have spirits and we have this familiar ghost, the inspiration. And this is where we begin to kind of weed out the garden of what are the possibilities. I'm suggesting Chapman, who we've already identified as being the leading candidate, if we're going to look at the things that he did that could have caused a fuss between him and another poem, between him and another poet,
Mm.
Hero and Leander is the most likely candidate. And of the two descriptions we have so far, it matches both.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Okay. I'll go along with it for now.
Okay. Now we go back to something that we were looking at before, which is every alien pen hath got my use. You remember that statement?
Mm-hmm.
That's in 78. That's in Sonnet 78. So
Right.
often have I called upon you for my use,
Yeah.
as my muse, as every alien pen hath got my use.
Right.
Okay, there's something interesting about that statement, because although we used it to identify Chapman earlier, it's actually plural, isn't it? Every alien pen. It's actually implying there's more than one.
Right.
There is a second completion of Hero and Leander done by a separate person,
Mm-hmm.
a guy by the name of Henry Peto.
Mm.
Have you heard of this?
I've heard of Henry Peto.
Okay. He published, and it's not very well known, but he published a continuation of Hero and Leander, also in 1598.
Mm-hmm.
And he dedicated this to a man named Henry Guilford.
Okay.
And it turns out, incredibly enough, Henry Guilford is first cousin of Thomas Walsingham. His mother and Thomas Walsingham's mother and Henry Guilford's father were brother and sister.
Okay.
So we have Henry Peto dedicating this to a family member of the Walsinghams. And in this poem, Henry Peto, who did actually write a number of things, but this was his first effort. He wrote some 600 lines in addition to the original Marlowe's 750 plus lines.
Okay.
Okay, this all comes out simultaneously.
Right.
Marlowe published alone by Blunt. You have Chapman completing Marlowe, published by, I forget the guy's name. And then you have, almost at the same time, but certainly before the end of 1598, because that's the date on the cover, Henry Peto's version.
Okay.
Now, if you are the author of, if you are saying every alien pen hath got my use, and
Right.
you're looking at two versions of Hero and Leander, both of which claim to have been completed by two different authors,
Right.
that satisfies that description.
Okay.
So now we have three descriptions matching Hero and Leander. And I would challenge you to find any poem that could match those three descriptions, especially every alien pen hath got my use.
Okay.
You're really at this point, you're starting to look this thing square in the eye. We really are talking about Hero and Leander, completed by George Chapman as being the poem that's got the argument rolling.
Mm-hmm.
Now then we go to the fourth statement made by the author of the sonnet, and this is in Sonnet 82.
Okay.
He starts the sonnet off by saying, I grant thou wert not married to my muse.
Mm-hmm.
And this continues. It's kind of a snarky line. I grant thou wert not married to my muse, and therefore mayst without attain or look the dedicated words which writers use of their fair subject, blessing every book. So this line appears to be pointing to Chapman's dedication of his Hero and Leander to Audrey Walsingham, where he says, this link between my Hero and Leander and Marlowe's, this jointure of them
Mm-hmm.
compares to the reunion of you in your marriage with Sir Thomas. So here you have the sonnet saying, I understand that you're not married to my muse. We don't have that type of relationship. I can't command you. You know, your sole utility does not belong to me. And you can easily overlook the dedicated words. And the word dedication pretty much stands out there. He's like pointing at the dedication that somebody wrote. And and between all of that, you have this thing that's being said by Chapman inside of Hero and Leander, of a marriage between Marlowe's version and Chapman's version being a figure, I believe is the word he uses, a figure of the reunion of Lady Walsingham with Sir Thomas. And I mean, that is something that is very hard to find as a description of anybody else's poem, where an author in his poem targets, and you were the one who's saying, you know, it's very typical that these guys would, you know, bounce off each other's poems.
Sure.
and try to outdo each other with their poems. But in this case, we have an author not bouncing off a guy's poem, but bouncing off the dedication.
Right.
And that's not typical. That is not typical at all. And why does he bounce off that dedication, except that it's Chapman who makes the comparison between the two poems and calls them a marriage.
Right.
So if I'm only looking at these statements as being descriptions, and I'm trying to find a poem that satisfies those four descriptions simultaneously, Hero and Leander is one poem that does that. And if I'm looking at George Chapman as the man who best satisfies the first five statements of a description of the rival, and then if I'm looking for what the rival did that could have caused all of this noise, and the poem Hero and Leander matches the next four statements, then I've got two things going here that are clearly described in the poem, in the sonnets. I've got Chapman and I've got his poem. And if you can find another poem absent Chapman that satisfies those statements, I'm perfectly happy. I'll throw everything out, because at that point we can start over, or we can just say this problem's not solvable. But if you have this, and this poem satisfies it, and Chapman satisfies it, you've come a long way towards clearing the air about all of this vagueness surrounding who the rival was and what this was all about. And I'll give you two more things that you should consider.
Okay.
They're not part of the poems, but they're worth recognizing. First of them is that all the poems that are used to describe Chapman, the nautical, the hymns, the alien pen, all of these things, all of these were written before or in 1598. These are all of Chapman's poems up to 1598 inclusive.
Okay.
So again, we're looking at a date in time. The other thing that we can note is that the dedication to Lady Audrey, which appeared in the 1598 publication, was excised from all further versions. So this argument, in particular, when you're looking at "I grant thou wert not married to my muse," or that these things are being published under your name, all of that falls away after 1598, because that's not happening anymore after 1598. So for this author to be addressing this issue, these issues, because in order for him to address the dedication at all, he's got to have his hands on the 1598 version, and he's got to be complaining about that version and no other version, which is to say that all of this was done around 1598.
Okay.
So, and again, all of these things and people, they all fit into that box. There's nothing falling outside of that box. They all fit into that box. So I want to stop there because I want you to, I want to get your reaction to all of this, because, I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm doing all the talking, and that's not fair.
No, that's okay. I mean, that the first thing I would say is that assumes that these things are literal readings, these lines, right?
Yes, I'm reading them literally. I'm not trying to make metaphors out of them.
So I guess my question would be, if they are to be read literally, what stops the other references to writing? Because a lot of the sonnets are about writing, Sonnet 18 most famously, obviously, but there are many others. What stops the others from being read literally as well?
Nothing. And now I don't want, I've said this more than once, but my focus here is strictly on these 9 sonnets.
Right.
In order to have this discussion about what they mean and what they portray.
Look, I mean, just if we go to Sonnet 82, for example,
Sure.
I grant thou wert not married to my muse, and therefore mayest without attaint o'erlook the dedicated words which writers use of their fair subject, blessing every book. So, I mean, I take that, I mean, even if it's literal, there's also a metaphoric element to it. Words that writers use. That is to say, writers sometimes will use words that are prettier, that carry different connotations, and so on and so forth, right? And not only for that purpose of making their subject fair, or more fair, but also to bless every book, right? So in
Right.
other words, to make the book, even feel more worthy than it might be, or to be perceived as, better than it is, just it's basically not unlike diplomacy. It's a way of telling somebody to go to hell in such a way that they'd enjoy the trip.
Yeah.
You
No,
know.
you're quite right. You're quite right. And
Um,
all language
so
does this to some degree.
yeah, so I'm so I guess there is that I'm not gonna say conflict, but um maybe tension between the literal and the metaphoric, or at least, if not tension, um, at least an admission that words mean more than just the literal. That's what those lines say. So that's something that I think has to be considered in the discussion.
I would not disagree with that. But that doesn't to me negate the underlying reality that he's addressing.
No, it doesn't necessarily do that, but at the same time, though, sonnet sequences and this is a sonnet sequence, and they were a fad at the time, right? For, as I say, maybe 15 years but certainly the sonnet sequence was a fad. So the expectation was that you couldn't really complete a thought in just one sonnet necessarily, at least not an elongated thought, right? So that there is a sequence which takes a much broader theme and tries to play with it. And I use the word play purposely because sometimes one sonnet might contradict another sonnet. It's on the same theme, it's on the same subject, it's on the same issue, but it takes it in a slightly different direction. It's sort of like a mind map in a way, just an idea and then blows it everywhere. Um, and I think which takes us back to the question of, mustn't we then look at the other sonnets as well, right? Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
ready to go, but
yeah.
not until I get
Not
you.
yet.
Not until I get
Okay.
you to
No,
the
fair enough. Fair enough. I just put it out there because I think it is an important element.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the next discussion then.
The next discussion will be who wrote this.
I'm happy to contemplate the possibilities. Let's just say that, and always happy to chat. Absolutely.
Question for you, Carol. We've reached the conclusion of the first two parts of Peter's case. The first part being that Chapman can be identified as the rival poet, and the second part being that Hero and Leander is the issue creating the rivalry. We're at the point now where I think Peter will say that's all the evidence he has and that he can present on those 2 points. Now, whether or not we have any agreement to that is another issue, I think. What do you think? Do you think that Peter has made the case of showing the 9 or 10 different statements and documents and backing them up? And does that evidence make the case?
Well, yes, I do, with the caveat, and I think that this is perhaps Joseph's position. We first of all have to stipulate, I think is the word I want, that we can read these sonnets in a literal sense. We can say that they are telling one side of the story, and the story they are describing is something that happened in reality. But if you are unwilling to accept that as a possibility, then obviously you're not going to accept any evidence at all, because obviously you can dismiss absolutely everything as saying, well, it's just a story. The poet is simply adopting a persona and he's making up a story. and this story is entirely fictional. And I think there in a way, this is almost irreconcilable, because unless you are happy to say that at least in part you can read it literally, then you're sort of stuck, aren't you? It's a brick wall. It really is a complete dividing line between two approaches. The thing I would say is that certainly for the past 100+ years in maybe more popular writing about Shakespeare, identifying the people involved has been a popular game, a bit more than the game. And I would go further and say, and the reason that people do it is because when you read the sonnets, you do get the sense of reality, not fiction. And it's very difficult to justify that or say precisely why, but you feel you are reading about something that really happened. And if you are reading about something that really happened, then Peter's analysis is correct. It fits all the circumstances.
Let me ask you this question then. Let's think a little bit about literary devices. We have metaphors, we have allegory, we have a lot of other ways in which literature makes reference to subject matter themes and even individuals. First of all, do we accept the notion that there is always an underlying fact for a literary metaphor? Do we accept that as a way in which literature works?
Well, I don't think there always is. I think there sometimes is. And the problem often is that unless you know something about the author's life and circumstances, it can be very difficult to make that distinction. To take a example from popular fiction, Agatha Christie introduced into her Poirot novels. Poirot is entirely a creature of the imagination. A character called Ariadne Oliver. Ariadne Oliver is a writer of detective fiction who has written a very successful series of books about a Finnish detective with a completely unpronounceable name. Now, in the persona of Ariadne Oliver, Agatha Christie complains about her publisher, her editor, the playwright she is working with to dramatize her novels, the letters she receives from readers complaining about holes in the plots. So is Ariadne Agatha? Not really. She's a sort of caricature of her. Does Agatha Christie use her to express her frustrations with her literary life? Absolutely. So is that a metaphor? Is that reality? It's a bit of both, isn't it? And I think, although it's obviously an example from popular fiction, I think it's quite a helpful way sometimes of thinking about things, that it's not strictly autobiographical, but it is very much rooted in her real experiences. What she is complaining about through her mouthpiece is what she wants to complain about publicly, but she can't really stand up on stage and say it because it would annoy too many people, but she can do it via this created personality. And I think perhaps that's what the rival poet sonnets are doing to an extent. They're making a very real complaint with a slight level of indirection.
Okay, well, let's take your example and say that Agatha Christie is writing a character who behaves much in the manner of her overbearing publisher, and she's a good enough writer that she gives it independent life. Only those in the know who may have dealt with this specific publisher would know that she's writing about him. But her average reader is thinking, well, this character, he's quite funny. Now, you're planning to write a biography of Agatha, and you want to make the case that this character that everyone's fallen in love with because he's so, Cantankerous is actually based on a real person. So you turn to the documentary record to see if there are any letters or correspondence that pass between them to the effect that if you keep this up, I'm going to make a character out of you in one of my novels. Well, that would tend to batten that down as opposed to it being a mere literary device, don't you think? So the question then becomes, can I find any documentation? Because the line seems to be blurred the way you describe it.
Quite. And sometimes it is the case that a writer does use a real experience, and it turns out that, well, another famous example would be Graham Greene in Our Man in Havana. In Our Man in Havana, the chap at the British Embassy, who is supposedly running a spy ring, because actually makes it all up. He just writes the letters. They're complete rubbish, because he's using the money he gets paid to finance his fairly pleasant lifestyle in the Caribbean. Now, that actually caused quite an upset, and Graham Greene was dragged into the appropriate government offices to face questions. Why? Because he was, in a literary way, drawing on a real situation in World War II, when a German agent called Juan Pujol arrived in Britain, immediately gave himself up to the authorities, and instead of publicly putting him in prison, they kept him out of the limelight and started an operation called Double Cross, in which he wrote back to his German masters of this vast network of agents that he had recruited in Britain, all of whom were entirely fictional. Whether Greene deliberately drew on that because he had worked in those departments during the war, or whether it was just simply something that was in the back of his mind and floated to the surface, I have no idea. But that's another famous example when something which sounds completely silly in some ways, and Our Man in Havana is a comic novel, is actually based on something that was very, very real.
I think it's very true that attention must be paid, as Professor Khoury warns us, to the literary devices that are being employed. But to the degree that we can clarify the difference between a purely literary device and something that is based on actual fact, and we can determine what those facts are, isn't that the job that Peter is trying to accomplish?
Well, yes, I would say yes. If we are willing to go with the idea that there is a reality behind these sonnets, then this is a reality that fits. And I think, although you could argue that this is circular, I also think it's reinforcing as well, that when you think maybe this is real and you find something that actually fits it properly, you don't have to partially quote and conveniently ignore bits, etc., when it fits so neatly, then I think you can say, yes, there is a case that this is real. These 9 sonnets actually are talking about something that really happened, and this is what they're talking about.
And there's another detail that I think he tries to make having to do with the timeline. For instance, all of the documents that he presents are pre-1598, so you can date this in time. And the one thing about this that he doesn't say, but it has just occurred to me, is that all these documents somehow come together, and that it's not just a scattering of things picked at whim, each one of them supporting just one single item, independently sort of just dangling there. These documents are all attached to a single event with a single set of people. So for me, this is a narrative. They are all part of one story, and they fit together inside that one story.
And as far as I am aware, there are no known details in the lives of George Chapman, Thomas and Audrey Walshingham that contradict the interpretation. And I think that's equally important because it's not only does it agree, it's also, does everything agree? Are there any facts which actually don't fit the theory? And as far as I am aware, no, there aren't. Everything we know about those people and their lives fits. We don't have to say, use those awful turns of phrase, oh, they must have, which is so common in biographical writing about Shakespeare. He must have done this. He must have known that. He must have been there. We don't know. But in order for our theory to work, he has to have been, so therefore we say he was. But we're not doing that here. We're only looking at what we genuinely know, and what we know fits.
Yes, okay. Very good, I think. And I think we'll now end on that note. You know, Peter has promised to tell us who wrote all of this in our next episode. So hold on to our hats, readers. I expect he's going to meet some pretty stiff resistance. Thank you once again to Professor Khoury for his important contributions to this investigation, and to you, Carol, for your wonderful thoughts as always, and to all our wonderful listeners out there who drive us on. I think it's more than fair to say that we couldn't have made the progress we have without all of you, all these ingredients in this pot. So make sure you join us again for episode 4 of the 4th season of Hidden in Plain Sight.
Hidden in